Thank you, teachers, for tuning in. I want to talk to you just a few minutes about this Sunday's lesson. You know from the title of the lesson that this is going to be a powerful lesson and that you will want to be prayed up as you come to teach this lesson. The title, Reconciled. And there will be people in your class that will have relationships that need to be reconciled, and they'll come looking for answers, and it's going to be a great time for you. And one of the things about this lesson that I want you to notice is under every lesson they have a summary statement of the lesson. And I have found these summary statements to be very powerful. I take time to read through it and define the words, and when I've done that and spent time with the summary statement, I've come to see some of the powerful truths in it. Let's just look at this one as an example. It says, reconciled relationships are a blessing from God, with the greatest blessing being a restored relationship with Him. Now just take for a moment that statement and let's see about what's going to happen in this lesson. First of all, it talks about reconciled relationships. We're not talking about broken relationships. We're not talking about angry relationships. We're not talking about fearful or bad or distrustful or jealous relationships. We're talking about reconciled relationships. The statement goes on, says reconciled relationships are a blessing. The word blessing there means to confer prosperity or happiness upon someone. In other words, when this lesson is concluded and people actually experience reconciled relationships, they will have more life. They'll have a better life, a happier life. That's the power of this lesson. But notice this summary statement also recognizes where reconciled relationships come from. Reconciled relationships are a blessing from God. They're not from our cleverness. They're not from compromise. They're not from fear. Reconciled relationships don't come from coercion or bribery. If someone's going to restore a relationship, it's going to be from God. And that's powerful because we know what happened to Jacob in chapter 32. Jacob experienced God. And that catches the second part of this summary statement. For it says, with the greatest blessing being a restored relationship with Him. In other words, what was formerly in the past is now restored. And there's love and there's peace and there's happiness. So it's important to see what's taking place in these lessons. Jacob meets with God. His relationship with God is restored. And out of that restored relationship with God, then he has the power and he has the grace to restore his relationship with Esau. That is something you don't want to miss pointing out, because so oftentimes the reason maybe relationships are not restored is we started in the wrong place. We started with them. And restored relationships always start right here. It starts with our own heart and getting our heart right with God. For then God gives us the power in which to approach people in a restored and a reconciled relationship. Now, when I started the lesson that I taught on Wednesday, I found a story about Scotty Barnes. You can find this story at the website of Focus on the Family, and she is the head of Forgiveness Ministry. I'm sure if you type some of those words in the search, the article would come up. It is a powerful story about her relationship with her father, who was in prison most of his adult life. 5 times he went to prison. She went to see him in prison, and she tells about that experience and what that was doing to her, and how he was saved in the last year of his life, and how they were reconciled. In the article, she says that he told her he loved her. And she made this statement. This is incredible. She's a 30-year-old woman. And she said when her dad said to her, "I love you," she said it took all the darkness out of her heart. Can you imagine that? Well, that's the power of this lesson that we're going to be teaching. Now, one more thing about this summary statement. That's the nail. You're the hammer. You only have an hour to teach the Bible. This is not a prayer meeting, though you need to take time to pray. This is not a fellowship meeting, though it's good to have a little bit of fellowship. This is not an outreach meeting. Please give your outreach worker, leader, a time to talk about outreach. But this is a Bible study meeting. So don't use up all your time with those other things. You have such little time to teach. And what you're teaching is one thing. You don't have time to go in 4 or 5 different directions and talk about a whole different issues. They've come and they've read the lesson, and you've prepared to teach on reconciliation. It's the nail, you're the hammer. When they walk out of your class, if you were to stop the first 3 people out of the class and ask them, give me a word that tells me what this lesson was about, your goal is they would say, well, the lesson was about reconciliation. So what I'm saying is you have such little time, you have such a powerful subject. Don't be chasing rabbits and going 100 different directions. Stay on the subject. Now, I trust you. I know that you're sensitive enough to the Holy Spirit that if something should happen in the class and you need to set the lesson aside and it needs to be dealt with, I trust that you will recognize this is obviously a work of the Holy Spirit. If that's the case, don't listen to me. But for almost every Sunday, this is what you're teaching and this is what you're getting across. As I mentioned, I started the lesson by talking about this story. And I ended it by saying to the class, now, if God can help reconcile those kinds of relationships, then God has the power to help us restore our relationships. But there's even a relationship that was even more difficult than the one Scotty Barnes talks about in terms of her ministry to prisoners, and that was Jacob and Esau. Think about this. Jacob's brother had homicidal intent for Jacob. He really, not metaphorically, not figuratively, he literally wanted to kill Jacob. And if God can reconcile those 2 men, then there's hope that God can reconcile relationships in our life. Now, the first point of the lesson is to put aside your pride. In every place where reconciliation starts, it starts with the person who's willing to deal with their pride and humble themselves. And the way I approached the text was I followed this first suggestion in your teaching plan. I said to them, I'm going to read the first 4 verses, and I'd like for you to listen to the emotions that must have been at play in this story. So as I read the 4 verses, they listened for the emotions. And then afterwards, I asked them to name what are some of the emotions, and that spurred a little bit of conversation. Then I went into the fact that I said, now, putting aside your pride involves 4 things. And I listed these, and I put them on the board. And then I said, can you tell me where you see this happening in the story that we're talking about with Jacob and Esau? And those 4 things are the person who puts aside his pride, number 1, initiates reconciliation. Number 2, requires courage. Number 3, owns the responsibility. And number 4, shows mercy and accepts forgiveness. And I gave a little bit of information in each one of those just to kind of spur the conversation. For example, in initiates reconciliation, Jesus told a story that said when you went to the altar to give your sacrifice, if you're just about to offer your sacrifice and you remember your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice at the altar and first go be reconciled with your brother. Now let me tell you the power of that. You've stood all day in line to offer your sacrifice. I mean, it's like Six Flags. It's like Disney World. You've stood in this long line to offer your sacrifice. Jesus said it's more important for you to make this relationship right than for you to worship me. You know what would be an evidence of that in this service, in this Sunday school, is if somebody left Sunday school and went out in the car and made a phone call. Or somebody left Sunday school and drove to somebody's house and got right and skipped church. That's what Jesus is saying. More good in following the will of God would be done if you did that. So the person who sets aside the pride, you can always tell the person who's dealt with their pride and has come to a place of humility. They initiate the reconciliation. Number 2, requires courage. I hate to do this. I hate to do it. I hate to eat crow. I don't like to make myself vulnerable, but it requires courage to do this and owns the responsibility. Again, let me mention, everybody that does reconciliation, the first place they start is not over there, it's right here. Owns responsibility and then shows mercy and accepts forgiveness. A person who doesn't do that is revealing that they haven't really understood the forgiveness that God gave them. They'll be tender-hearted towards the person. Now quickly, let me go on. Number 2, be genuine, verses 5 through 11. And I took the suggestion that they had here, except instead of breaking it up into teams like I mentioned before, I don't really find that works well in the classes that I do. I just told them the outline. There's a question, and then there's an answer. There's a question, and then there's an answer. And then as I read through the text, I gave them some explanation of those texts. But the point of this lesson that it's wanting to stress is that Jacob's response to Esau was genuine. Now, how do we know that? Esau asked Jacob, what was all this procession of 5 waves of animals that came towards me? That was 550 animals. It's huge. He may have given up half of his wealth. Esau knew that Jacob was genuine in his reconciliation because what Jacob had taken from Esau was wealth. And Jacob enriches Esau, and he understands. He understands Jacob knows what he did to me, and he's being real about this. Every act of reconciliation needs to communicate to the person who's been offended or the person we're seeking to restore, I understand what I did. I understand what I said. In AA, number 9 rule of their 12 steps is you have to make amends to people that you've hurt or harmed. But in making amends, it's not just something that conveys what you feel. You convey that you understand what it meant to them when you hurt them. The only way that people will begin to trust is if they're confident that we know how we hurt them. So it's being genuine in making amends. The last point is agree on limits. Let me tell you about a website that you could go to and you could get some help on this. It's called Townsend and Cloud. Just Google that. That'll take you to their website. These 2 men are Christian psychologists. They've written a powerful bestseller called Boundaries. The book was so successful that they've written a whole series of books on all kinds of boundaries now. They have a website, and it's a whole list of things, and they have like 5-6 minute little videos on just an innumerable number of topics. The only problem with that is you'll probably spend more time looking up your needs than you will the needs for your Sunday school lesson, but you can listen to some of those and it might give you some direction or some examples in which you can talk about agreeing to limits. And that is, when we reconcile, this is the explanation of Jacob stepping away from Esau. Every statement that Jacob makes reveals that he knows God. Every statement Esau makes reveals he doesn't know God. And Jacob separates himself from that. So, limits. Now, the way I closed the session is I go back to this summary statement that I had written on the board. And I simply follow the suggestion here and ask, do you see where this is demonstrated in the lesson? And then the way I closed it, I finished it, is I asked them to turn to page 72 in their teachers in their student quarterly. And on page 72, there are these 3 statements. Identify relationships you need to mend. How can you restore the relationship? And number 3, what actions do you need to take? And I asked them, would you just find some time this week when you could sit down and quietly with the Lord just go through those 3 statements and then ask him how, as the question says, how do I act upon that? Listen, I am so grateful for you. More good and help is going to happen this Sunday in our Sunday school classes because you're going to come prepared spiritually and mentally to teach a lesson on reconciliation. I cannot thank you enough for the good work that you're going to do. God bless.